to episode 155, the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is John Dinning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
Welcome back, buddy.
Thanks, man.
Welcome back.
I've returned to Napa.
Yeah, I can say we missed you. And return to the podcast. It's been a minute since we had a chance to do one of these.
Yeah, it's been a couple of weeks because I've been out of town, and you took a long trip, and then I just took a long trip. So good to be back. Also sad to be back.
Yeah, I feel you.
Mixed emotion.
I feel you. It's nice when we get these little month breaks between tests so we can finally go have some fun. I can tell you it's going to be a little while before we get another one because we got 4 months back to back here coming up, August through November.
Yay.
The meat grinder. Which is why here on a Wednesday afternoon, you and I think are justifiably having a drink. What do you got?
Indeed. Well, what I'm having is called The Last Word. Kind of an old school cocktail. It's like 100 years old. It's got gin in it, which of course is not my favorite. It's also got like green chartreuse and lime and maraschino cherry liqueur. And then I threw a bunch of sugar in it to drown out the pernicious effects of gin.
I wish I could see the color of this thing because I'm picturing cherries and green and gin.
Yeah, green chartreuse isn't like truly green by itself. It's got a little bloody kind of.
Well, in classic me style, I've gone slightly simpler. I know you and I are both kind of keeping an eye on some of the Euro Cup developments, and England played today in a semifinal match that was kind of thrilling. Spoiler alert for those who haven't seen it, but England won. And in celebration of the England team's victory and moving to the finals, I'm drinking an English beer. A pretty pedestrian English beer. It's just a Newcastle.
Newcastle's all right.
It's okay.
Toon Army up there, but yeah, I watched that game. It was good. I really enjoyed it. In fact, when I was in London, I was there for, I think, the second match that England had, and it was remarkably low key. They didn't seem all that enthralled, and obviously England didn't play that well. I can't remember if that was the Slovenia game or whatever that they drew out, and it was like boring, but the crowd really wasn't all that jazzed up about it, so I was a little disappointed. Either way, they're moving on to the final, so we'll see how that goes.
They are. I'll be rooting for them in the final, but if I had to put money, Spain.
It's the worst possible opponent for them. Somebody who's really good.
Yeah, somebody's good.
Yeah.
Well, if I've got any Newcastle left, I'll be drinking them during that game for sure. I'll probably have moved on to gin, so you're an inspiration as usual.
You can have all the gin I have. I just don't like it that much.
Anyway. That was the last they saw of me. You picked the song for today, and I know why you picked it, but maybe you should elaborate.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about the upcoming Crystal Ball. There's been some changes that we've made to the format, so this episode I think is going to be relatively short. Just want to talk about what we're doing, why we're doing it, some of the changes that we've made, but in kind of a nod to something that we'll talk about shortly. The song that I chose is Private Eyes. It's by Hall & Oates, who I think is, in some respects, criminally underrated from their era. Man. There's just a lot of really good songs. If you go through their canon, I often find that I'm like, man, that's a good song. And even when I don't think it's any good, then I listen to it and I'm like, that's better than I thought. I didn't really like them when I was around the 80s and 90s. They weren't really my favorite band, but as I've gotten older, I'm like, man, they are actually really good. So Private Eyes, I think kind of matches the theme of what we'll talk about in a few minutes.
Yeah, if people don't know the reference as to what that means yet, you'll understand soon enough. This will make sense in time. Before we get to that, though, let's talk a little bit about the LSAT world. Not a whole lot of developments recently, but certainly some developments ahead, big ones. The next 2 tests that are on the schedule, as I mentioned before, 4 straight months starting in August, but the next 2 are in August and September. That August test is going to run that 4-day cycle, Wednesday, August 7th through Saturday, August 10th. The registration for that, if you're not signed up for August, I have bad news. The deadline for that is passed several weeks ago. In fact, it was June 27th. And the score release for that test is Wednesday, August 28th. The September test, you can still register for. The deadline for that isn't until July 23rd. So you've still got a couple of weeks, in fact, for that. The test dates for September, again, 4 days, Wednesday, September 4th through Saturday, September 7th. And you get your scores that month as well, September 25th, which is a Wednesday. What a Wednesday. So there you
Always
go.
Wednesday.
Yeah. The only bummer about what I've just said is that the deadline for registering for September, and of course the score release for August, are not even close. So again, there's no chance that you can get an August score and then still take September. It's either sign up for both or wait until October or later.
That's exactly right. But if you are taking any of those tests, there are always free seminars that we're running. The next two that are coming up, there's one on July 23rd. We're going to do logical reasoning, common flaws in reasoning. And then on August 6th, we're going to do a basic conditional reasoning webinar. And we expect to see conditional reasoning feature a little more heavily on the new format test starting in August. So I think that'll probably be a very worthwhile webinar. The only other thing I'll mention, John, is that if anyone was noticing, the LawHub Advantage fee has risen. On July 1st, LSAC kicked in some new policies, and LawHub Advantage, I think, was $115 before, has now gone up to $120. So that's a little change. There's some other changes afoot with LSAC that we've been talking to them about for the last month. I'm not going to get into those yet until they're final, although technically they're final because they're already in place, but everything's negotiable because they can be very reasonable about things like this. And so maybe talk about that in a future episode, some of the other changes that they have, but nothing that will affect, at least the LawHub Advantage pricing further. That's set and already started with them.
Yeah, it's an interesting way that they do things sometimes, where they deliver a verdict of sorts, but then they're still willing to listen to closing arguments. It's like, well, guys, it's a little out of order. Talk to us first. But at least
the best laid plans.
Yeah. At least they don't completely shut the door even after they think it's closed.
No, I mean, you and I have spent a lot of time talking to people at LSAC, and I generally find them to be quite affable and reasonable. Sometimes the decisions happen and they're like, oh, we didn't realize. And I'm like, okay, so let's talk about that. And usually their door is open on that. So certainly these days, much different than it was, say, 10 years ago. You couldn't talk to them at all. Now I'm like, there's actual people there, and a lot of them are pretty friendly. So that doesn't change anything if you're a test taker who just had a bad test experience. The fact that some of the people in the administration are actually, trying to help. But at least it's good to know that it's not just a faceless corporation and that there are people working on your behalf.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of LSAC, and watch this little segue.
Oh.
The biggest change in my experience with this test, or my involvement with it, and arguably the biggest change since 1991, happens in August. And I think most people are aware of this at this point, that the last Logic Games LSAT ever happened last month in June. There are no Logic Games on the test anymore, and here comes the little pivot. What that means is that we've had to rethink the way that we're going to discuss upcoming tests, at least in advance of them, with people. And that's what we want to talk about today.
That was a good pivot. I hoped that's where you were going with this. So obviously there's a couple things that we do, I think, on a regular basis, John, that people know us well for. One of them is the podcast recap of each test, where we kind of go through what the content of the test was, make scale predictions and so forth. And at least as far as the August LSAT, that is a ways off. That's over a month away. So I'm not going to talk about that. But the other thing that I think we're pretty well known for is the crystal ball that we've been doing for over 3 years. And so let's talk a little bit about that, because we've set ourselves up in a situation where we've got a new test format and we want to do a crystal ball for it, but things are a little bit different. So let's go ahead and dive into that.
I think the best way for us to go through this and explain ourselves, and to just give people a better sense of clarity and a peek behind the curtain of sorts as to where our minds are, is to almost do this in the form of like a Q&A. We've gotten some questions. You and I have asked each other some questions about how to best approach this in our thought process. So let's take it from that, I think, as a rough structure. And the place to start, for those unfamiliar perhaps with us calling the crystal ball, is just to ask the question of what is it? When we say the crystal ball webinar, what in the world are we even talking about?
Well, the name was supposed to, I think originally, we were like, we want to look into the future. We want to kind of like do that wizardry thing where you could say, hey, I've got this crystal ball. I can predict what they're going to do in the future. And we actually started off with the idea that we would go back and take a look at the types of questions that appeared most often, the type of, at that time, logic games or reading comprehension passages. And then very quickly it morphed into us actually predicting specific content that we thought that we would see on the test. And so really that's what it became, a prediction about what are they going to emphasize from question types, conceptual ideas, reading comprehension topics, specific game types, and even which tests we thought that they would reuse.
Right.
And so that's what the crystal ball was. And as many of the listeners that we have know, we ended up being far more accurate than we ever expected could be done. The percentage we were hitting, I think at the end, like 90% of the overall number of crystal balls had correctly predicted some content that people had, at times predicting all 4 of their reading comp topics in detail.
Yeah.
Not just saying there's a humanities passage, but saying, hey, there's actually going to be a passage on Zora Neale Hurston and it talks about this.
Yeah.
So it was, that was what it was. That's what it's always been. It's what we want it to be.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think a lot of people listening to this may not realize, because this time of year there's a bunch of new test takers, people just starting their LSAT journey, but the test makers don't release most LSATs, which means they get to reuse them. They keep them private and then they pull them back out however many months, years later. And what you and I found was that if we tracked the content that we heard about on those tests and then we paid attention to the pattern of reuse, we could start to anticipate when other tests would be reused. And we got so remarkably good at this that allowed us not to just say like, hey, I think you're going to get a reuse of the test from October 2021. But it allowed us to say, these are the 4 topics that you should study for reading comp, or this is the nature of the games from that test because we knew it. Go study these games as analogs, as preparation tools. So that's what the crystal ball is kind of morphed into. And to your point about the accuracy, I can't remember the last time we did one where at least a portion of the tests weren't predicted. And at times, June in particular, we predicted entire tests cover to cover.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes we would say, hey, we really think you should study, say, a double circular game. We've got an example in our course. Go study it, do the drills around it, because we think they may actually use that, and then they did. Or as just happened, where we said, hey, there's a game that's really similar to that September 2016 virus game. Go study that, and then that game actually appeared. And of course, that's always gratifying because people would write in and be like, you saved me, or that really helped.
Yeah.
And that was something that, we've been doing for years at this point. I think every single time it would happen, John, you and I would look at each other and be like, this is great. When's this going to end? It's going to end sometime, right? We can't keep getting it right. I think we started off and we felt we were more lucky than good. And by the end, we're like, no, we actually have it pinned down.
Yeah,
we have
actually did. We cracked this code. It's funny, though, you mentioned when is this going to end? Because that looming concern, I think, has never been more present or perhaps on our minds as with a change like this. And that's going to be kind of the theme of what we're doing here. That's a little different for this one. Before we do that, you want to get into the specifics of the...
Yeah.
All right.
So, I mean, your comment there actually, begs the question of, are we going to do one? Have we decided to completely shelve it, or are we going to do some version of it? And the truth is, we're going to do some version of it.
Yeah.
So we're going to do that upcoming here on Wednesday, July 17th. It'll be the usual time we do this, which is 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. It'll be John and I, just like it always is. We're going to have Jay Donnell and Adam Tyson along for the ride, to answer questions and add their insightful additions to what we're talking about. So we are going to do it. Is it going to be as long as it has been in the past, John?
Well, we just lost a third of it when they pulled games. So it would be, you and I can stretch pretty well. I think if we wanted to make it as long, neither of us would have a difficult time doing it. But no, this one should be a little shorter. They've typically run about 90 minutes. I think this one will probably go about 2/3, probably 60 minutes or so.
What was the joke about the writer Marcel Proust was that he could write 30 pages on rolling over in bed. I feel like, John, you and I can take any topic and stretch it into 30, 45 minutes. We love to talk. So we're the Proust of podcast lengthening.
Hemingway used to give Faulkner a hard time about this. He never met a sentence he couldn't expand or something.
Yeah, and Hemingway was the guy who was trying to chop every sentence down to as simple as possible. Yeah. So, but we have lost a big portion of what we work with. It was a section that I've been doing for several years, so I just took another shot to the arm there. Yeah. I think this probably shortens it down to about 60 minutes or so. We have decided to add a few little wrinkles. One of the things we're going to talk about is the old scales versus the new scales, and the expectation of how that might change scale predictions, as well as what that means for test takers in terms of how many they need to get right and so forth. So we have a little thing, we'd already decided we were going to add to kind of like bulk it back up a little bit, but it won't be as long as it has been in the past. And since ultimately it will be something that it's a bunch of PowerScore students at, we will I'm sure take questions at the end and just talk to everybody. So if you're going to be there, definitely bring questions for us. We'll do our best to answer them.
Yeah, well, you just, I think, led right into the next question by saying that it's going to be a bunch of PowerScore students. Traditionally, and you mentioned we've been doing this for over 3 years now, and we've done it for every test administration, reliably, consistently, every time. And we've always opened it to the public, both the live session and the recording after the fact. This is going to be different. You say there's a bunch of PowerScore students there. You're right, but it's exclusively for PowerScore students this time, both the live session and the recording of it, including the recommended problem sets that we'll provide for logical reasoning and reading comp. It's only for our students. And we'll go on to elaborate as we talk more about this as to why that is the case. But one of the clear themes as to why, and we've already touched on it a couple of times, is we're in uncertain territory here. And the more that we can keep things, I think, uniform in the room, where a test that could be as, variable or unpredictable as this one might be, the easier it is for us to kind of manage what happens with people. So which students of ours will get access? Because I've been asked this question, dozens of times in the last couple of days. And it's going to be available to any students that have any kind of enrollment with us, like a course student, tutoring student, or a testing analytics subscriber. Those students all have access to our online student centers, which is where this will be posted after the fact. So they all get access to the live session next Wednesday and the recording and problem sets afterwards. There are a couple of, say, PowerScore studiers who will not necessarily have access to this. If you don't fall into one of those former groups that I just mentioned, let's say you've bought the Logical Reasoning Bible, or you've signed up for what we call our starter access, which is just a free membership that we offer. Those people will not have access to the recording or to the live session. So it's exclusive to people who are currently enrolled with student centers.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing because for a while, John, I think you and I were like, we're not going to do it at all.
Yeah.
I think our theory was, we don't know what's going to happen here entirely. This is we are flying without any type of radar or lights or vision. We just don't really know what's happening. And so we're like, I don't know if we'll do it. Maybe we'll just wait and see. And then we're like, well, we'll do a smaller version of it.
Yeah.
And especially kind of like be able to, avoid some of the things where we're really uncertain, or make it quite clear that we're really uncertain. And what we don't want to do is go out there and just say to, thousands and thousands of people, hey, this may or may not be worth your time.
Yeah.
With PowerScore students, one of the advantages that we have is that we can update and communicate with them because we have identified who they are. We can post things in their student centers. We can make changes to the recording. It's not an issue. It is literally, I'm not going to say a captive audience because it certainly isn't, but it's an audience that we have a very close community with and that we can immediately make changes. If we determine that something that we have thought is going to happen isn't going to happen, I can immediately tell every student that and be like, hey, actually, let's change course on this. So when we're in uncharted waters like this, we want to operate cautiously. And that's really what this is. It's out of an abundance of caution. I realized that for the last 3 years, every single one of these has been free to the public. And it was not a light decision that we made to say, hey, let's at least take a look at this one and pull back a little bit while we're in uncharted territory. This format change, as you said, John, is probably the biggest thing that's happened. In terms, we just lost Logic Games. It's been a stalwart of the test since June of 1982.
It's been kind of the defining feature of it.
Yeah, very much so. It's 40 years. It's one of the things that we use to help predict the test usage because we could very easily connect Logic Games to tests that they would reuse. That's not there anymore. It really makes it much harder for what we are doing. And so we'll probably de-emphasize the prediction aspect of this topic or that topic and focus more on, historically, what do they do from question types? how many of this type of question will we see? How many of that type of question, which is still incredibly useful, but it's not the same predictionary type of thing that we've done in the past that has made it so kind of, I think, stunning at times when we were able to get it right.
Yeah, I think in a way we're almost victims of our own consistency for 3 years because people just expect it. It's become such a commonplace and such a focal point for people preparing. The idea that anything with it might change, I think, was alarming for folks. But if you had asked me, Dave, 3 weeks ago, if we were going to do an August crystal ball, I would have said no. Now, I don't know that I would have had like no in all caps, but I would have been pretty firm on the fact that I don't think we're going to do one. So this is, in a way, I think, a compromise of sorts.
Yeah. This allows us to work with it, see what we think about it, work with a new format. And you have to realize that if you have a massive format change like this that actually removes a lot of what we use to help predict test reusages, it's also possible that LSAC could say, this is our opportunity to break pattern, start in a whole new direction. We don't like being predicted, and I know they don't. So maybe what we should do is, switch it up. I could see them doing that. And so it's just a lot, like I said, uncharted territory for us, and it's something that we want to make sure that we're very careful with as we go forward, hence our decision here.
Yeah, I've had to do some some mirror staring at times with this where I'm like, are we doing this purely out of ego? Like, if we're going to be embarrassed by getting something wrong, is this a case of us just wanting to be embarrassed in front of our friends and family and not publicly? I don't think it's that. I think it's more the idea that if we can control who experiences what we're going to do with this in ways that we haven't been able to in the past, it allows for us to communicate the messaging of uncertainty in a much more effective way. That's how I've always seen this.
Yeah, this allows us to really, I'd say, hedge our bets a little bit as we go through that conversation. But, in past crystal ball, somebody would come in, they would watch it, and they'd be gone, and we had no way to really communicate with them. So if we had changed something or said, hey, we actually think it might be this, or more of it or less of it, what have you, we can't get to them. And now we will be able to do that. And it also makes it easier for us to hone in on some of the stuff that we do at PowerScore that other people don't do. Like, I don't know how many times, John, during these webinars, you would talk about justify questions or method AP questions, and people would be like, what are those? What are those? What are those? And be 100 questions about what it is that we're referring to. That won't happen now because everyone will be aware of what we're talking about. That allows us to be a little bit more specific about certain things. It's just an easier thing. And, to your point of a couple of weeks ago, I wasn't sure we were going to do this. I totally agree.
Yeah.
We were very much on the fence about whether or not we would give this a shot, and then we kind of came up with a way of doing it. I will say, when we're done with it, assuming we're satisfied with what has happened and the way that it went, and I'm pretty sure the session itself, since we're doing it, we'll be fine with that. We will post it in the PowerScore student centers. Meaning if you're a PowerScore student and you miss it, you'll be able to come back and see it. If you're a PowerScore student post that session, like you sign up 3 days later, you will be able to access it. However, it won't be posted publicly. There won't be a form on our website like there always has been that says, hey, you want to go see it? Come here and do that. Maybe in the future there will be, which is a different question that we'll kind of come back to here in a second. But at least for post this session on the 17th, it'll be in the PowerScore student centers for PowerScore students, and that's it.
Yeah, let me add another couple of points here where I find that to be a particular benefit for what we're trying to do, whether we capitalize on this or explore it or not. One is, and you mentioned this before, how many times people are confused by just PowerScore terminology or strategic things. What's a circular game? What is templates? But it also gives us the ability to know that everyone in the room is not only studying with the same strategies and techniques, oftentimes the same content, but it also tells us that everyone in the room has the same access level to real LSAT content in general. And what I mean is all the student types that I mentioned before have confirmed, guaranteed basically access to something called LawHub Advantage. It's a subscription that LSAC runs. And we cannot show digital content at all with real content in it unless we know that the person we're showing it to has that subscription in place. We confirm it with our students. That's how we're able to teach them. But it would also mean that we could theoretically do this in one of these crystal balls now. We've never been able to do that before.
Exactly. Because we had no idea. There's no way to confirm that that the average crystal ball attendee of years past had LawHub Advantage. Now we will know that everybody in the room has LawHub Advantage. It's also one of the reasons that the starter access students, and that's just, it's a free sampler kind of course that gives you a sense of some of the things that we do. It's part of the reason they're not getting access to this is because they don't have to have LawHub Advantage.
Yeah, I could see this actually becoming, again, I think it might be a little premature to do it for August because we just need to see that test, man. It's going to be such a bellwether, but I could see us going down the road, maybe doing something for October, November, where if, again, we keep it private, beginning to actually teach a couple of questions that we feel are emblematic of changes we saw in August and September. We know a lot of experimental logical reasoning sections of the last 18 months have had some very intense and complex conditional/formal logic types of structures, sort of mini games as they're often reported. We don't know that those are going to appear in August, but if they start to appear in real sections, you can bet we're going to find some old questions like that from real tests. I'm going to show you how to do them. We can't do that to a public audience.
Exactly. And I think that makes a difference because we're trying to figure out what we're going to do in the future with this. And so I'll actually address a question I know that both of us want to talk about, and I think we're going to bring it up later, is this it? Is it just private forever and it's over? No, that's not the case. This is a one-off for us. We don't know what's going to happen. We may come out of August and say, you know what, it's not going to be as valuable as we'd hoped, and that was it. That's the over and done end of it. Or we may come out of August and say, okay, that they actually did what we thought that they were going to do. Things are going in the direction we think. We can return this to what it was before. We may return it to full public access. We don't know. And I realize some people are mad about this, where they feel like that's not fair. You always made it free. And I'm like, I realize that, but I can't control LSAC's desire to change this test. And I just have to react to it. This is the best thing that we think we can do. We're not trying to cut off the general public. And so we're definitely leaving it open in the future that it may go back to being a public thing. Just don't know. I need to see what happens. Anybody who thinks they know exactly what's going to happen with the August LSAT is fooling themselves. And John, test preparation is a business of not fooling yourself. So we're not going to do that. We're not going to fall into that trap.
Yeah. I also see a world in the future where a potential hybrid sort of session exists. And Dave, we haven't really talked about this explicitly, so welcome to my mind in real time.
But I think I already know where you're going, and I like it.
You probably do. Where there's a public version and then sort of an after hours. We've talked about doing this with the podcast, like an after dark, where we really get to talk about the way we want to talk about things. But where we actually do real content, but we can only
swear.
Improvise.
Is that what you?
Yeah.
We get to swear.
Biting my tongue for 5 years. But we could actually do real content as sort of an exclusive bonus. And then that's the video that we post for PowerScore people internally, but there's still a public session. I could see something like that happening. I think we will revert back to some form of this being public after these tests, assuming things don't go so off the rails that we just feel hopeless or helpless.
Yeah, all that's speculative, assuming a lot.
Yeah.
Let's go see what happens in August and then we'll figure it out. And a lot of what happens in August is going to be determined by, how close we can see the content and how much of an insight we get into the content.
I know where you're going with this.
I think, John, you and I both have a deep-seated concern over the fact that this test is now 2/3 logical reasoning. And just as kind of like backstory, when we go through these tests and we're trying to figure out what it is that we're going to talk about in the podcast that does the test recap, we have to be able to identify what the content was.
Right.
Now, we have extensive files. We've talked about those before on test history usage for both things that were released eventually as well as experimental sections. So we can often match sections together. And sometimes there's some hiccups. Occasionally they'll move out a game or they would move out a reading comp passage or change some LR. But one of the things that we consistently struggled with was not determining what the reading comp and the logic games was. Mm-hmm. Once you get like the notable game, you usually can piece most of it together and kind of like work backwards. And usually people will remember at least 2 to 3 games. They might forget the very first one, but they'd always remember at least 2 to 3. Same thing with reading comp. They'd get 2 or 3. They might skip one. And those big chunks were really easy because a lot of times the test makers would use the same LR from certain tests from administration to administration. So once we knew they were using certain RC, we would think they're using a certain LR. But LR is always more difficult because it's 25 topics. And sometimes the topics are so broad. You know, if somebody says it was a transportation question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Fossils. Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Dinosaurs.
Right.
To cite a great example. I'm like, well, wait, dinosaurs using tools, dinosaur and the curvature of their claws, dinosaurs gripping trees. What is it? What kind of dinosaurs? And so we've always felt that the big struggle for us on any test day and doing the test review was to figure out the logical reasoning that would get in here. And so now having this be 2/3 of the test really makes us concerned about our ability to identify precisely what it is. So I think that makes it a lot more important for us. I think you and I will certainly be on the hunt after the August LSAT to see exactly what was inside each section. And I think it's going to be a lot harder for students to figure it out too. We've said this before. After the test, if you really want to figure it out, what do you need to do? You need to take notes when you're done so that you're able to say, well, that was my first section. This was my second section. Some of you are about to get 3 logical reasoning sections. About an hour after the test, it's going to be really hard to figure those out.
Yeah.
Because you will be like, was that my section 1 or was that my section 4? So I would really recommend that everybody take really good notes out there so they can figure out afterwards which one is experimental. It could be brutally difficult. I see a world where we do this podcast for August and we're like, we don't know which one is experimental.
Yeah.
It's entirely possible that that occurs. And that will happen because we didn't get enough information about the test from test takers or from our own observations or what have you.
Yeah. That 3 LR scenario, by the way, would be 2 scored and 1 experimental LR and then scored reading comp. But that's going to happen. It's absolutely going to happen. It's funny to sit here and listen to you basically sift through the pile of our worries because the crystal ball is about our concerns of being able to predict things as accurately as we've had. And these test recaps are about our concerns of being able to identify things after the fact as well as we have. So there's really no moment where in anticipation and in hindsight, there's really no moment where I don't think this is going to be a struggle.
Yeah. And, you know, this is why I take some of the criticism that I've seen online of this decision to kind of put it behind the PowerScore walls. I take it with a big grain of salt. I'm like, I know people don't realize it looks easy. We try to make it look easy. We act as if it's easy. It's not. Most people don't get to see like the concerns that we have over, hey, you know, is this going to be accurate? We have got a lot of concerns about this test change. And that's why we were like, let's pull it back. Let's be as careful as possible. Let's see what happens in August. And then at that point, we'll make a decision. Yeah. Maybe there is no more crystal ball. Maybe we're like, we crush that. We're going to do it for the public once again, and we'll return it. This is not something where there's a particular motivation financially or anything. This is, really us trying to control as much as we can in terms of our messaging, who we're speaking to, and how we communicate any changes and so forth.
Yeah, I hope no one thinks that this is just a money grab because I promised this is not going to, drive revenue. This is more just a control factor. But it is. I love that you've introduced a whole separate worry now for people, a whole separate anxiety based on ours, which is like, are they going to get rid of the test recaps too? My gosh,
no, we don't want to.
God,
if it was a money grab,
into the sunset.
The first time we ever got anything right, we would have been like, make it private or start charging for it. We did it for free for over 3 years. We repeatedly were accurate about it. That time has come and passed. I think if anyone is questioning our track record on doing things for free for the LSAT community, they need to stop and take a look at like the actual record, because I think we're well on the side of the good there.
Well, uncertainties aside, one thing I will say that I'm feeling very confident about, and I think that you and I both are always quite confident in, are the recommended problem sets. We are still going to include those, as always, but the key to the recommended problem sets and why I feel more confident about them maybe than the specificity of our predictions or even the detail of what our recaps might include is that these problem sets are really built on 2 fundamental principles. One, of course, is the predictions. We saw this with the problem sets before June, where we were expecting certain, for instance, games to appear, that virus game being a perfect analog of a game that appeared in June. And so we recommended that specifically, basically to show people exactly what we thought they might face. But more importantly and more fundamentally is we always build these problem sets around skills, around techniques and strategies and concepts that we know are going to play a vital role for people. So regardless of the specific content that might appear, what underlies it, these problem sets, I think, are kind of perfectly exemplary of what people need to know to perform well. So those will be there. Again, we'll include those in the student centers with the archive of the video. And I'm sure you can speak more to this too, because you have played a large role in designing these problem sets as we've done this over the years.
Well, I think it was why we always didn't worry about the predictions. We wanted them to be right. We were super happy when they were right. But if they were wrong, we knew that what we had recommended you study would still be helpful, because there was going to be certain types of what we saw. There was going to be this skill. There was going to test this particular concept. So even if we didn't get the exact topic right on an RC passage or logic game or what have you, we still knew that there would be things in there that would make you better overall and were worthwhile to understand. So it was kind of like a no-lose strategy.
Yeah.
Somebody who went out and did the recommended problem sets, if they understood what the drill was and how they were supposed to do it and what they were supposed to learn, they would always improve. They would always have more knowledge. They would always be more prepared for the test. So we're not going to stop doing that. Again, we hope that any prediction that we make in terms of content is spot on. That's always the goal. It's always a long shot. It's always difficult. But even if we're not right, it'll still be helpful, and that's hugely valuable.
Yeah, I think the comment I've made before, like with respect to reading comprehension, was that if I expect there's going to be a passage that's going to appear on, say, cosmology or astronomy or something, then I'm going to include sample passages about that idea. But even if that topic doesn't come up, the fact that you've now maybe suffered, but learned your way through some difficult science passages, that will absolutely pay huge dividends, because there is going to be a science passage on your test. The topic might be different, but the nature of this type of prep and this understanding, that's what's really critical. And that's really, I think, at the heart of the problem sets themselves.
I would have to agree.
Yeah.
Speaking of kind of like value, one of the questions I know that you've gotten is the idea of, look, is it worth it for me to enroll in a PowerScore program just to gain access to the crystal ball? And I think I've gotten this question once or twice. I think you've gotten it more than I have, though.
I get it a lot. Yeah. In fact, I just got it this morning, I think, from some people on Reddit. And it's funny you asked that question. I was just thinking about this in a sort of analogous sense to the problem sets that we were just talking about. When a topic matches, it's sort of the cherry on top. But the real value is the nature of what the problem sets kind of exemplify or contain. And I feel the same way about the things that we sell. So let me take this question in two parts and jump in at any point, Dave. The first is this. Every time we do one of these crystal balls, the feedback that we get, usually in real time in the room, but certainly after the fact, often includes comments like, I can't believe you guys do this for free. I would have paid X dollars to have this. And whatever that X is, it's almost certainly always more than the value of, say, our testing and analytics, or the cost of the testing and analytics, which is $35 to get enrolled in.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So when people value the crystal ball as a standalone, it's almost always valued or quantified, objectified as something greater than the way you could access it here. So that's my first comment, is I don't know how I would price the crystal ball as a standalone kind of commodity. But I know that when people have attempted to, that there are still cheaper ways to get access to it from what we're doing right now. I think you've made the comment before even that, if we felt like we could put a price tag on this thing as a standalone, we'd have probably sold it as a standalone by now.
Yeah, but we're not going to do that.
Right. Well, not yet. Well, we'll see what happens.
I don't think that's ever going to be the case. It's certainly not the universe I want to live in. Which, just as a sidebar, somebody was just like, oh, you guys are just trying to like make this a money grab. I'm like, absolutely not. If this was a money grab, we would have done it 3 years ago when we got the first prediction right and said, woohoo, now people have to pay for it. This has always been free. I think anybody who's listened to this up to this point understands that, hey, our goal in putting it into the PowerScore Student Centers isn't to monetize it. It is literally to kind of like pull it back and be able to navigate really what's a very turbulent time period in LSAT history. One of the benefits that you and I haven't even talked about is the session that we do will be much smaller than it has been in the past. Sometimes in the past, the chat is so crazy that it's just hard to even follow along. We know there will be fewer students in there. So we get all sorts of benefits from doing this. The financial benefit isn't one that I think matters because you and I both believe that the courses that we sell, the analytics, what have you, we feel like that's already a good value.
Yeah.
You said cherry on top, and I think the direction you were going with this is don't take a course for the crystal ball. Take the course because the course is good. You get the crystal ball as a free addition to it is essentially what's happening.
Yeah, I like that you raised that point because I mentioned I was going to answer this in kind of two parts, and that's really the second part of my response, which is the idea that I think the question itself, should I buy a course or testing and analytics or tutoring solely for the crystal ball? I think that's a flawed premise, frankly, because you're buying the resource. This is now just an extra part of the resource. If anybody was going to buy the testing and analytics, spend that money and think that what they really paid for was the crystal ball kind of in exclusivity or isolation, I would strongly encourage them to take a look at the testing and analytics that they also get, because that's where the value really is. That's what we're putting the price tag on. The crystal ball at this point is just a free dessert.
Yeah, nothing changed in terms of our pricing with this.
No.
And at least to that monetization question, you and I have already said within this podcast, if we can return this to the public domain and make it free again and to all test takers, we will do it. We're doing this because we want to make sure that we don't go out and tell thousands of people, oh, this is exactly what's going to happen, and it doesn't happen. We want to make sure that we're able to watch them and then, as we've said, update our communication to what is a known set of people to us, our students, who we can get to immediately with communication. So to me, I understand why that would be the first thought somebody might have, and they might complain about it. But I'm like, I think there's a pretty long track record in history here of us doing what we can for the community and not charging people for it.
Yeah.
So,
and I'll reiterate too, and we've intimated this in a number of places. I know you've kind of hinted at it on Twitter, and I've certainly talked to people that several weeks ago, there was a very strong chance we weren't going to do a crystal ball at all for August or September. This to me, again, represents that kind of compromise where we can do it in a way that we're comfortable with, but also still acknowledge the fact that we're uncomfortable.
Yeah. The discomfort is the thing that most people can't see.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think to be fair to us, I think it's so rare that we do feel it or certainly express it, that it feels a little weird to me too, both to talk about it, but even to experience it. I don't have a great sense of what's going to happen in August. This is our ability to kind of acknowledge that fact, but still try to provide as much help as we can.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that actually is a really good summary comment on this, John, because when we approach this crystal ball, I think both you and I are excited for it. It's obviously a completely new era. We also have trepidation that I don't think we've had for years in terms of approaching this, just because of the uncertainty. We'll attempt to navigate that. We prefer to navigate that with our students and be able to control the messaging as much as we possibly can. Once August hits, I know that during the days of that test, you and I will be very carefully watching and wanting to hear from students and see how their tests went and get feedback and so forth. And then at that point, we'll make that decision as to what we do. And anything's really possible. Maybe that's the last crystal ball ever that's coming up here in a week. Maybe it'll return back to the public domain immediately. I just don't know. And I don't think anyone can know right now. We need to see what LSAC does. And the good news is it's only going to be about a month and a half, and we will have all these answers. So for those of you who are like, oh, I'm not a PowerScore student, we'd love to have you as a PowerScore student. If you're like, that's not going to be possible given the time frame, well, if you're taking the LSAT later, check back with us. Hopefully we can return it to the public. That'll be our preference. It always has been our preference. We like big audiences, and those crystal balls attracted thousands of people, which is a super cool thing in a market as small as the LSAT, to have that ability to talk to that many people. We just don't know. And it would be dishonest of us to say that, oh, we have all the answers on this when no one has all the answers on it. So I think what we're just trying to be is straightforward about acknowledging what's happening.
I think if people realized how little we're here for the money and how much we're here for the acclaim, they'd understand that this is actually kind of self-defeating in a way. This is not a money grab.
Truth.
This is going to limit our audience in ways where I'm not going to get the typical ego stroke. And that's regrettable.
That's pretty much what we do it for. All right, John, on that note, and for everybody out there, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment or a rating as well. And if you have any questions about anything we've said here, or anything about the LSAT or law school admissions in general, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, we hope this was helpful. We'll probably be back relatively soon with more podcasts and certainly in the crystal ball in a week or so. Stay safe out there. We'll talk to you soon.